This is the 4.6 Progressivism Summary video. If you haven't already, please go and watch the other Progressivism video on 4.6 that's also linked online. Progressivism is a broad movement where reformers are trying to fix a lot of problems that are going on at the time. It developed because concerned citizens wanted to fix the problems in the cities, the workplace, and the government. This was a movement of the middle class who objected to paying taxes to corrupt city governments and desired better city services. They're basically trying to fix a lot of the problems that we've discussed in the previous units. The media plays a big role in the progressive movement. There's a famous group called the Muckrakers, who are journalists that investigated corporations and pointed out bad conditions in the factories. They also looked at corruption in government and the power of the monopolist. These journalists got their name because they were raking up the muck and they were showing people the bad conditions via pictures and stories in the paper. The most famous of these journalists was Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, and it was about the meatpacking industry. We'll listen to the clip of the book in class, but it really shows the bad problems of the meatpacking industry and how gross it was. Many women participated in the progressive movement and social reform. The movement west had helped women get the right to vote. Western states generally allowed women to vote before Eastern states. African American women also participated by joining the National Association of Colored Women, and they promoted equal rights and suffrage. Women became increasingly frustrated that they did not have a political voice. Carrie Chapman Catt was one of the first suffragists. She lobbied the state legislatures to give women suffrage. Alice Paul went a different route. She split with Catt, and she lobbied the national government for an amendment on women's suffrage. So one tried going the state route, the other tried going the national route. Alice Paul was a little more radical than Carrie Chapman Catt. She engaged in marches, she picketed the White House, and she engaged in a hunger strike while in jail. We'll watch a video clip of that in class. The 19th Amendment ended up being passed, which gave women suffrage, which means the right to vote. Then Paul started campaigning for an Equal Rights Amendment, but that amendment failed. Another important woman of the progressive movement was Jane Addams. She started the Hull House, which was a settlement house meant to help immigrants. It would help educate immigrants and help give them advice, give them child care so they could go find jobs, and all these different types of things to help immigrants acclimate to the new country. President Theodore Roosevelt is considered to be the first progressive president. He uses what's called the bully pulpit, which means his position as president and his ability to lobby the press to push progressive reforms. In fact, one of the examples of that is the coal miners' strike. The coal miners went on strike. The company refused to negotiate with them. He uses the bully pulpit to get the company to negotiate with them. He also uses legislation passed to increase the power of Interstate Commerce Commission over the railroads, and he also supports the government regulation of monopolies through the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he's known as the trust buster for getting rid of monopolies. Congress and Roosevelt also protect consumers through the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. He read The Jungle, was disgusted by the conditions, and helped get the Meat Inspection Act passed. The Pure Food and Drug Act was meant so that drugs and food would be labeled properly so that people wouldn't accidentally overdose or take the wrong thing. And these were both very important pieces of legislation. He also uses his position as president to set aside a lot of land in the West as national parks. One of the best examples of that is Yellowstone National Park. So he's a conservationist. In 1912, he wanted to run for president again, but he doesn't get the Republican nomination. So he starts the Progressive Party, which is also known as the Bull Moose Party. It ends up causing the Republicans to lose the election because both him and William Howard Taft are running as Republicans, even though he's running as a third party, and Woodrow Wilson then wins the presidency as a Democrat. Woodrow Wilson is also a progressive president. Congress passes the Clayton Antitrust Act while he's president, which allows labor unions to be exempt from antitrust laws, like the Sherman Antitrust. They passed the 16th Amendment, which allowed a progressive income tax, which the populace had wanted back a few units ago. They also passed the 17th Amendment, which allows for the direct election of senators. They passed the first Federal Child Labor Act, although the Supreme Court eventually rules it unconstitutional. They also passed the Federal Reserve Act to regulate the money supply. And they also made credit more readily available to farmers. They set an 8-hour workday for some workers compensation for workers injured on the job. So in summary, Woodrow Wilson's presidency was very positive for progressives and for some of those old populist agenda items too. Although he is not going to be very progressive when it comes to African Americans and women's rights. The progressive era comes to an end because of World War I. The 18th Amendment was passed, which prohibited the sale of alcohol, and it passed because of the anti-German sentiments during World War I and also the grain shortages. Wilson has these great 14 points that are very progressive. However, in the Treaty of Versailles, they don't actually incorporate very many of these 14 points, so people become disillusioned with progressivism. The 19th Amendment also did not lead to any significant changes, even though women got the right to vote. Plus, people are kind of tired from the war, and it's also tired of like the progressive agenda, and so this whole like conservative movement sweeps the country in the 1920s, effectively ending progressivism. We need to conclude this lesson by comparing women's suffrage and the progressive movement. Both were middle-class movement that used a lot of women. They tried to get legislation passed. They both used talented, educated supporters. They both faced significant opposition. Presidents helped the progressive movements, but really did not help the women's suffrage movement that much. In fact, Wilson was very anti-women's suffrage. Women eventually took a more aggressive approach, and they marched and picketed, which didn't really happen in the progressive movement. So in summary, the progressive movement was a movement to try to fix the problems in society, has some success and some failures. Later movements like the New Deal and the Great Society will be heavily influenced by the progressive movement and will continue the work of the progressive movement.